Thank you so much, Dirk, and thanks for having me in this series. Um, all right, so this is not, I should say that this is not kind of a standard talk I give, so it may not be quite as smooth as I normally try to make talks, so please bear with me. But I thought this general topic should be of interest to a lot of people, and especially in the aphasia community, which I know a lot of you belong to. So I want to tell you about a line of work that I've been pursuing since my days as a postdoc with Nancy Kamusher, so for over 10 years now, and it's kind of evolved over the years, and I think we have some pretty clear answers at this point. Here are the main folks that spanning postbacks, grad students, postdocs, and collaborators who have done most of this work. And I especially want to highlight Dan Blanc, who led big chunks of this work, and he now heads his own lab at UCLA and is looking for awesome grad students. So if you're an awesome undergrad applying for PhD programs, definitely consider his lab. He's one of the deepest thinkers and nicest human beings I know, so would be a great mentor. And the references here are to the key papers that I'll be talking about, and they're all available from the website. That's why I'll be skipping some methodological details sometimes. Okay, so we can take any sample sentence, like if you only read the books that everyone else is reading, you can only think that what everyone else is thinking. There's been a long tradition in psycholinguistics and cognitive neuroscience to describe both lexical access and syntactic and semantic parsing using domain general cognitive constructs like storing information in working memory, retrieving it from working memory, updating focal attention, inhibiting irrelevant meanings or parses, selecting an option among alternatives, and predictive processing. And the core question that I want to tackle today is whether these kinds of mental operations are implemented in language-specific fronto-parietal cortex or in domain general circuits of the fronto-parietal executive network. I will begin by introducing the two brain networks of interest, one supporting linguistic processing, the other executive functions, like working memory and cognitive control. The latter network I will refer as the multiple demand or MD network throughout the talk, following John Duncan's terminology, who was one of the kind of main discoverers of that network. And I should note that the existence of each of these networks has been questioned over the years, so this introduction should bring us all on the same page, hopefully. I will then show you that the two systems are spatially and functionally distinct using different kinds of evidence. And then critically, I will argue that all the core computations related to the processing of language, of linguistic input, are carried out by the language-specific network and not by the multiple demand network. And then I will conclude with some open questions and maybe a speculation if time permits. All right. So we have known for quite some time that a set of brain regions in the left hemisphere respond robustly when we understand linguistic signals, both auditory and visual, and when we generate linguistic utterances. These regions that I often refer to as the high-level regions are distinct from lower-level speech perceptual regions in the auditory cortex, from the letter recognition regions in the visual cortex, and from the motor articulation regions. Unlike those lower level regions, these regions are very deeply sensitive to the meaningfulness of the signal. They respond much more strongly when the input is interpretable compared to when it is perceptually similar but not interpretable. And so you can find these regions by contrasting neural responses to, for example, reading or listening to sentences with the processing of pseudo words or an unfamiliar foreign language. Showing you here some sample activations in 4 different subjects. And these activations are incredibly robust, and they're stable across variation in the materials you use, in the modality of presentation, like visual or auditory, in the task, and also in the language, which language you use. So just to illustrate robustness to task, this is from a recent study led by Anya Ivanova, where participants were presented with sentences and non-word sequences and had to perform different tasks from passive reading to reading and doing a memory probe, to reading and answering comprehension questions, or reading and making positive, negative meaning judgments. And under all of these conditions, sentences elicit a reliably stronger response than non-words, and the magnitude is affected by how much linguistic material you have to process. So these conditions by their design include two sentences, longer strings of non-words, and these are just single sentence stimuli, but not much by the type of task that you're performing. And the activation topography here shown in a sample subject is incredibly stable across variation and tasks. So these are 5 different task conditions, and you get beautifully replicable responses in these language areas. More evidence that this network constitutes a true natural kind in the brain comes from Rod Braga's recent work showing that these regions emerge from signal fluctuation patterns during resting state. So here are 3 sample subjects, and in black outlines, we're showing here that we're showing here the network as it was defined by the signal from the signal fluctuation data with no language data at all, and overlaid in different colors. In colors are activations for the sentences greater than non-words contrast, which is a contrast that my group has been using for over 10 years now to identify language responsive areas. And there is a strikingly tight correspondence between these very 2 different ways of obtaining the system from neural data. To illustrate robustness to what language you're processing, we have now generalized the basic topography of the network and its key properties to over 40 diverse languages from 11 language families. This is work co-led by Dima Ayash and Saima Malik Moraleda. Here we're just showing sample activation maps across these languages, and a lot of the key properties I'll mention today about this network hold for these diverse languages. Okay, so aside from these basic properties, these regions appear to be highly selective for language over diverse non-linguistic tasks, a point that I will elaborate on more in a couple of slides. Each of these regions is sensitive to both the processing of word meanings and to combinatorial processing. A point I won't talk about much today, but there's a recent paper in Cognition 2020, which summarizes a lot of that work. And finally, these regions are causally important for language processing in that damage to the system in an adult brain leads to deficits in comprehension and or production. Okay, now on to the other system of interest, the multiple demand network. This network resides bilaterally in the frontal and parietal cortex. These regions respond robustly to diverse demanding tasks, from arithmetic to deductive reasoning to novel problem solving, and the degree of engagement seems to depend on the difficulty of the task. So the more effort you have to put in, cognitive effort you have to put in, the greater the response in the system. This network is generally argued to support goal-directed behaviors, and its activity has been linked to notions like working memory, cognitive control, and attention, very much like the notions I mentioned in the context of thinking about linguistic processes like lexical access and syntactic or semantic parsing. And these regions appear to be linked to fluid intelligence, both in terms of individual differences in activation patterns and also causally, so that if you damage the system, you lose some IQ points, and the more of the system you damage, the greater the loss in fluid intelligence reasoning. I should note that both the language and the MD networks have been argued by some to include subdivisions. The nature and the kinds of subdivisions that people have proposed vary, and I would argue that for each of these systems, the subdivisions remain controversial. But for the purpose of this talk, I will just treat them as functionally integrated systems. So the language system and the MD system, but we can maybe talk about potential differences among each of their regions towards the end. Okay, so now onto the relationship between these two networks. When I came into the field of cognitive neuroscience, I guess I came to the language research a little bit earlier, but that was in 2007 or so. People often broadly talked about the lateral surface of the left frontal lobe, which is quite a substantial chunk of the brain. And they would use notions like the inferior frontal gyrus, and some still do that. And the following kind of reasoning was quite prevalent. Somebody would say, okay, certainly language processing engages some kind of executive demands like working memory or cognitive control. Language tasks, some language tasks elicit responses in the left frontal cortex. Executive tasks also elicit responses in the left frontal cortex. Therefore, frontal responses to language reflect the engagement of domain general executive computations. That doesn't fly when we're talking about such broad patches of cortex. So this just doesn't follow. And I've generally been always interested in whether language processing is supported by specialized machinery, given that specificity or overlap with other functions for that matter critically informs the underlying computations, which I think a lot of us are after. One of the first studies I carried out was looking at the responses of language regions to non-linguistic tasks that have been hypothesized to share machinery with language, to see if any of those hypotheses hold any water. And this, of course, included diverse executive tasks, which was from one universe of claims about language overlapping with non-linguistic cognitive tasks. So now I will summarize 5 kinds of evidence for a robust dissociation between the language and the MD networks, including within the left frontal cortex. So starting with distinct functional profiles, I will show you responses in the 2 networks to language and several non-linguistic tasks. So let's start with the language network. In black and gray, I'm showing you the responses to sentences and non-word sequences, which are used to localize these areas. But the responses are estimated using data not used for defining the region, so there's no circularity in estimating these magnitudes. And in different colors, I'll show you responses when participants performed simple arithmetic additions, had to hold some information in working memory, or to inhibit the prepotent response and choose some task relevant response. In each of these tasks, we had included an easier and a harder condition, because historically when people have used executive tasks, they would do so and then look for a signature of a greater response to the harder condition. So a working memory task with more things to remember versus fewer things to remember, or remember for longer or shorter period of time. And so here are the responses to 6 non-linguistic tasks that we've looked at, with a focus on here math and 5 different executive tasks. And as you can see, the responses are very strongly selective for language. And this is just a sample frontal language region. The rest of the regions look similar. And so know that everything is always plotted relative to fixation. So 0 is a fixation condition where there's just no stimuli and you're looking at a blank screen. So notice that it's not just the case that these regions don't show a harder over easier contrast for these executive tasks. It's that when participants are solving a math problem or doing a Stroop task or holding information in working memory, this brain region in their brain works as hard as when they're looking at a blank screen with no task whatsoever. So this seems like pretty strong argument against this region engaging in non-linguistic executive functions. Okay, so, oh, and of course, but these regions work really hard when you process language, hence the strong response to a linguistic condition. So what about the MD regions? So here again, I'm showing you a sample MD regions, but they all look very similar. So here the picture is drastically different. So these regions appear to respond to diverse demanding tasks and more strongly to the harder condition of each task. Interestingly, these regions respond to the 2 language test conditions in the opposite way, showing a stronger response to unstructured and meaningless non-word sequences compared to meaningful and structured sentences. Presumably because the latter requires less effort, but I'll keep revisiting this point throughout the talk. So we'll have more chances to think about this. Another source of evidence comes from dissociations between language and executive functions in acquired and developmental disorders. So for example, to ask whether language and executive functions share machinery, we can examine executive abilities in individuals who lack a properly functioning language system, as in acquired aphasia. And most telling are cases of global aphasia, which results from severe damage to the entire fronto-temporal system, typically due to a massive stroke, although there are other etiologies as well, and leading to profound deficits in both understanding and producing language. And this is my colleague Rosemary Varley at UCL, who has been studying these patients for a while. And over the years with her colleagues, she showed that these patients, although severely impaired linguistically, show perfectly fine performance on a wide range of non-linguistic tasks, including general reasoning abilities, aligning really well with the picture that has emerged in our fMRI work, where general kinds of reasoning tasks, executive tasks do not elicit a response. What else should I say here? So yeah, and some of these tasks load on the MD system, of course, and that's consistent with the fact that the language system is distinct from that system, because damage to the language system does not lead to problems with MD loading tasks. Conversely, patients with damage to the MD network who have deficits with goal-directed behaviors and exhibit a loss of fluid reasoning abilities do not tend to exhibit problems with language comprehension and production. So why have so many prior studies got it wrong, concluding that language and executive functions overlap in their cognitive and neural substrates? I will make a brief aside here and argue that a plausible explanation has to do with methodological limitations present in prior work. So most prior studies have relied on averaging brains in a common space and assuming voxel-wise functional correspondence. This approach is fundamentally flawed given two properties that human brains have. First, the precise locations of language areas are substantially variable across individuals. This is not news. We've known this since at least Brodmann, but also much before. And second, language regions lie side by side with the MD regions in the frontal cortex. Together, these two properties mean that any analysis based on voxel-wise alignment in a common space is not gonna yield interpretable results. And this applies to both brain imaging studies and studies of patients like voxel lesion symptom mapping type approaches. So to illustrate a little bit, here I'm showing you 3 individual subjects. In red, you see the activations for a task targeting the language network, and in blue, a task targeting the MD network. You can already see from the kind of detailed patterns of where these red regions land that there is quite some variance in the precise locations of these networks. We have recently been exploring this variability a little more systematically in the context of a project where we're creating a probabilistic activation overlap atlas based on data from a language localizer task we've run on over 800 individuals that was scanned in the last few years. And so here, the information contained in this picture is in each voxel, how many people show language responsive cortex. And you can see that the highest kind of overlap we get is around 65%. There's a handful of voxels in the temporal cortex that has that level of overlap, but in the frontal cortex, it maxes out at around 15 or 20% overlap. And this, to kind of drive this point home a little more in a different way. So here in different shapes, we're highlighting areas that correspond to the same voxel across people. Well, here it's more than voxel, a little chunk of the brain that belong to different functional networks, right? So for example, this little chunk, can you guys see my mouse?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So this chunk corresponds to the language network in this individual, but to the MD network in this individual. And so the bottom line here is that any kind of averaging in the common space will be blurring these two networks together. And given that they have opposing functional profiles, you're likely going to get all sorts of effects washed out. And you probably don't want that in most cases. And so I would say that if you want to draw meaningful conclusions about the frontal areas, you need to take this inter-individual variability into account. And so to address this problem, I developed a set of experimental and analytic tools that enable individual subject analysis, and all the work I'm presenting here. And these tools are all publicly available, both the localizer tasks and the analytic pipelines. All the work I'm presenting here relies on this individual subject approach. Okay, so back to our evidence of language and executive function reasoning abilities being dissociable. So in addition to acquired disorders like stroke-induced aphasia or progressive aphasia, there exists evidence for this dissociation in developmental disorders, although perhaps somewhat more controversial. So these include cases of individuals with Down syndrome, Williams syndrome, and Turner syndrome, all of these individuals have relatively preserved linguistic abilities, but are impaired in general reasoning abilities in somewhat different ways. This also includes the few but striking cases of language savants, who again are quite impaired on a number of cognitive abilities, including kind of general reasoning, while exhibiting superior linguistic performance. Another source of evidence comes from patterns of signal fluctuations during naturalistic cognition. So that's a method that has kind of transformed the field in some ways. These naturalistic paradigms are becoming increasingly more popular. So Dan did this a few years ago. Dan Blanc did this a few years ago. So he defined language and MD regions in each participant and extracted time courses when participants were either resting in the scanner or listening to some stories. And then he looked at the correlations of the time courses among the regions within a system, so between one language region and another language region, or between one MD region and another MD region, compared to between pairs of regions straddling the boundaries of the network, so taking one language region and one MD region. And when you look at this, and so these are now average correlations across participants, and you find that within network correlations are strong for both the network and the MD network, so regions of each network form strongly functionally integrated systems, but the language to MD correlations are effectively at zero, suggesting that these regions do very, very different things as we are either lying in the scanner, resting in this case, or similarly when we process linguistic information, including in this case as we examine the processing of stories that were artificially constructed to increase quite sophisticated linguistic phenomena, to potentially kind of work against ourselves to see if we can maybe find this synchronization between the systems, and you still just don't see any hint of this. So the bottom line here is that there's little relationship between what language brain regions do versus what MD brain regions do during diverse paradigms. And we've replicated this now with new participants and using a wider range of naturalistic paradigms, including movies, different kinds of linguistic stimuli, and so on. We find similar results in the complementary approach that we developed in our group. I haven't heard of other groups using this, but the logic is kind of similar, but it's using task data. So we have people who have done the language task and one or more of the MD tasks. And we're basically exploiting the variability among individuals in the strength of their fMRI responses. So some people generally activate things more or less. And we know that some of that variability is likely due to state or trait variables, like how vascularized your brain is, or how much caffeine you've had before the scanning session. But importantly, there seems to be variability on top of that general variability that reveals once again the dissociation between the language and the MD networks. So what this graph shows you here is that if I look at how strongly you activate, say, your inferior frontal language area, I can predict quite well how strongly you will activate your posterior temporal or anterior temporal language area. And similarly for predictions from one MD region's magnitude of response to another, but looking at how strongly you activate your inferior frontal or another language area, I don't have much predictive power for predicting the strength of your MD region's responses. Finally, the lifetime trajectories of executive and language abilities are different. So our cognitive control abilities are slow developing in childhood and don't reach full maturity until early adulthood, which we're currently evidencing in some cases of COVID breakouts in colleges. Yet already at age 3, children can understand impressive amounts of linguistic input and even produce impressive amounts, as I'm acutely witnessing right now with my 3-year-old daughter. And similarly, our executive functions decay as we age. So here's some data from George Hartshorn's work. So the most relevant are the red and the blue lines, which are 2 kinds of working memory tasks. And you can see that they peak around 20 and then just worse and worse and worse, very depressing. But our language comprehension abilities remain intact, and some aspects of language, like for example, vocabulary knowledge, here shown in black, actually improves with age. So based on this body of evidence, I would argue that the language and the MD networks are functionally distinct. So now we can get on to the critical question of what these regions do exactly during language processing. Given that they are functionally different, how do they divide linguistic labor? Is one of them more important than the other? And that's the question we'll go to next. So I'm going to argue that in healthy adults, the language network does all the heavy lifting, and that the engagement of the MD network is restricted to language tasks with extraneous task demands above and beyond the demand of language comprehension. I will briefly present 5 lines of work for this point, some of which I've briefly alluded to, but we'll recap as needed, and don't worry about what's on the screen right now. I'll go through each of these sequentially. Okay, so first, one of the long observed functional signatures of language brain regions is that they respond more strongly when we process sentences compared to when we process lists of unconnected words. And here's some fMRI data from just some experiments we've run in the lab that included sentences and word list conditions. And you can see consistently across studies, there's about 2-fold increase in the response to sentences compared to word lists. Presumably, these stronger responses reflect some additional computations that take place when we process sentences, but not when we process word lists. And what these additional computations are remains debated, but common ideas include things like syntactic structure building, semantic composition, and predictive processing. So, do the MD regions show a similar preference for sentences relative to lists of words? They do not. So to illustrate, I will show you first data from a recent meta-analytic investigation of experiments that we've run in our lab. So we took 30 of our experiments. They're all language comprehension experiments, and they vary in all sorts of ways, but critically for this question, they include sentence comprehension conditions and word comprehension conditions. And this is nearly 500 unique individuals, and almost 700 sessions went into this data set. This was a heroic effort led by Yevtyachik. And so using those data, as we would expect, given what I've already showed you, we robustly see the effect that we've been seeing in individual experiments. So here now, each bar is an individual condition in an experiment. And on the left here, ignore the colors for now. On the left here, we have all the conditions that use sentences, and on the right are conditions that include word lists. And so as expected, we see this nice stronger response to sentences than word lists. But in the MD network, we find the opposite pattern. So overall, the responses are lower, but the responses during the word list conditions are stronger than the responses during the sentence conditions. So this result puts into question the role of the MD network in any combinatorial linguistic operations related to syntactic parsing or semantic composition, because one would expect brain regions that support such operations to respond more strongly in stimuli where those operations would get engaged, like sentences. The second kind of evidence comes from examination of how closely language and MD regions track linguistic input. So what the hell does it mean to track linguistic input, and how can we know if a region tracks linguistic input? So the general approach known as intersubject correlations was pioneered by Uri Hasson at Princeton, and the logic goes as follows. If we put 2 people in the scanner and present them with the same stimulus, say a story or a movie, of course we would expect a lot of idiosyncratic activity in their brains, but to the extent that the 2 participants are paying attention to the stimulus, there should be some aspects of neural activity that will be related to changes in the stimulus over time. And those should be shared between people who are exposed to the same stimulus. So for any given region in the brain, we can use the similarity of bold signal time courses as a proxy for the degree of stimulus-related processing. For example, the primary perceptual areas like V1 or A1, the signal fluctuations are very similar across individuals as participants process auditory and visual stimuli respectively. So Idan asks how closely the activity in the language and the MD regions, which are quite a bit higher level regions than primary visual and motor auditory cortex, during the processing of linguistic stimuli. So concretely, we extract responses from each target region in each subject as they listen to naturalistic stories. And then we compare each individual subject's time course to the average time course of all the other subjects. And these are Idan's beautiful animations. Could never do that. And then we compute the intersubject correlation, and then we average these values across all individuals. An important note here is that, again, these stories, I've already mentioned these materials, they were constructed so as to be difficult to process. So they contain a large number, an unusually large number of infrequent words and constructions, many cases of temporary garden path-like ambiguity, many non-local dependencies, like in object-relative clauses or object-relative clefts, and so on. And this was done to ensure that the lack of tracking in the MD regions would not be due to the overall low cognitive demand elicited by these stimuli, given that we generally know that the MD system is highly sensitive to the level of demand. To determine a possible upper bound, we first examine intersubject correlations in primary auditory areas. So this is auditory story comprehension. And as I said, those regions track these stimuli very well, showing very time-locked, stimulus-locked activity. And combining data across several experiments, so we've now done this across 3 experiments, the auditory region showed intersubject correlation values of around 0.45. And so then we used that as a ceiling to investigate how close to that ceiling the tracking is in the language versus in the MD regions. And I like sharing these kinds of things because I think it's useful, especially for early career scientists. I was totally expecting / hoping that both systems would track linguistic stimuli really, really well. And then we could try to figure out what are the different features that may be doing this. But instead, science happened. And what you find is that the language regions track these stimuli incredibly well. About half of the variance relative to the upper bound determined by the auditory intersubject correlations is shared across individuals, which is very high for a high-level domain study. And so these regions seem very machine-like. They get their input and they do their crunching, whatever form that crunching may take. In contrast, the tracking of the in the MD regions is much substantially lower. And then it then replicated this pattern twice. One possibility we also considered is that maybe the slower tracking in the MD network has to do with the fact that people are just different in what they find challenging in language. And so maybe for some people, it would be something like infrequent words because they have small vocabularies. For other people, maybe they really have trouble revising syntactic parses, and so on and so forth. And so what we did, we also complemented this investigation with looking at the MD system's time courses within individuals. So if I scan you on a story today and I bring you a year later and I scan you on the same story, is your MD system going to be showing some consistency in its patterns? And we find that no, that's not the case. The within subject analysis very closely replicate what we find here with intersubject correlations. So it seems that MD regions just do not closely track linguistic input. And that again undermines any potential role of this network in any computations that relate to stimulus properties like inhibiting irrelevant parses or selecting a meaning of a word based on context, the right meaning of a word based on context. Okay, a third strand of evidence comes from recent examination of the language and MD region sensitivity to linguistic surprisal. So various results in psycholinguistic studies have shown that listeners and readers actively predict upcoming linguistic material and show sensitivity to how expected incoming elements are. However, the mechanisms that support predictive processing have again been debated, as everything else in language research, meaning the question is whether these processes are supported by domain-specific circuits that represent the relevant knowledge or by highly domain general circuits that may support prediction across diverse domains. So Corey Shane, a graduate student at OSU and a future postdoc, examined sensitivity to syntactic and lexicalized string-based n-gram surprisal during naturalistic story comprehension and found robust and independent effects in all the regions of the language network. So the key lines here are the red and the blue that correspond to the PCFG syntactic surprisal based on a PCFG parser and a 5-gram surprisal in blue. And these effects also explain a large chunk of the variance, 37% of explainable variance, which is again pretty high for these kinds of high-level tasks. And the MD network did not show sensitivity to either kind of surprisal anywhere, reliably generalizing to out-of-sample data. You may ask yourself, what about studies that show that prediction effects during language comprehension are not present as strongly in populations that have reduced executive resources, such as kids, older individuals, non-native speakers, and so on. And for this, I wanna, oh, that was supposed to be up already. I will point you to this nice opinion paper that Rachel Riskin wrote, where she shows how these kinds of effects can be explained by differences in the quality and the nature of linguistic knowledge representations in those populations compared to adult native English language speakers. Doesn't have to be English, of course. Okay, I want to mention another recent line of work, which I'm super excited about, that provides further evidence for the language network implementing predictive processing. So a recent class of artificial neural network models, ANN models, trained on word prediction tasks appear to form representations that approximate linguistic meaning strikingly well. So these models can do tasks like answer questions, generate free-form text from prompts, translate between languages, and generally perform at impressive levels on many benchmark NLP tasks, natural language processing tasks. And this kind of generic broad coverage functionality is potentially promising for modeling language processing in the brain. Because in absence of animal models, this may be our best shot to get to computationally precise implemented models of how language comprehension actually happens. So we can maybe finally get beyond the boxes and arrows, drawing boxes and arrows on the brain, which is just not satisfying if we really want to understand what's going on. And so inspired by recent success of this approach where ANNs are related to visual processing in both animals and humans, we gave it a try using the same analytic framework developed for vision. This approach, so this was led by Martin Shrimp, a graduate student at MIT. And so the general approach is the following. So you take stimuli, in this case, of course, they're linguistic stimuli, you present them to humans, using different kinds of neural recordings in this case, or into different classes of models. And then you try to see if you can regress model representations extracted from a particular part of the model that can also be explored. Whether these extracted representations provide a good fit for actual human neural activity during language processing. And so we presented language stimuli to both humans and a set of 43 state-of-the-art language models, to see how generally well this might work. If no current models provide a good fit to human neural data, then it's a non-starter and we can't really build much on that. But it actually works surprisingly well. So here I'm showing you how well representations from different models, so shown here in different colors, predict neural data in one of our data sets. And in a horizontal line is an estimated ceiling based on the internal reliability of the data set. And these are just different kinds of models. They're simple embedding models, and then a whole wide range of transformer style models, which are the models that kind of do best in current NLP work. And so there's two things to note here. So one is that some models, like the very recent transformer models like GPT-2 Large and Excel, already get us to the estimated ceiling level. So we can basically explain all of the explainable variance. And I'm not showing it to you here, but the model fit to activity extracted from the MD network is substantially worse. We also see that there's really quite a lot of variability among the models and how well they fit the data. And this kind of variability allows us to ask very exciting questions like what makes a model a good fit to human neural data. So for example, in vision, ANN models that do really well on object recognition, visual classification, tend to do better in predicting neural responses in monkey physiology work or in human neuroimaging work. And so building on the work that established the core role for predictive processing in language, we looked at the relationship between how well models predict an upcoming word. So this is here on the x-axis, where there also exists variability among the models, and how well they predict brain data, shown here on the y-axis. And indeed, we find a very strong relationship, so that performance of a model on the next word prediction task robustly predicts neural scores. Importantly, model performance on other linguistic benchmarks, where some models also achieve quite good performance and models are variable. The tests we've looked at so far are tests from the GLUE benchmark set, for those of you who may be familiar with it, which basically includes tests like grammaticality judgments, sentence similarity judgments, and so on. Scores on those tests does not explain neural predictivity. And so to me, this result potentially intriguingly suggests that optimizing for predictive representations may be a critical objective for both biological and in silico neural networks, network models for language processing. And we're building on this in various ways now. And then finally, not quite finally, one more thing is here we directly, I'll just briefly mention this, here we directly try to relate behavioral comprehension difficulty assessed with two common psycholinguistic measures like self-paced reading and eye tracking during reading to neural data. So now regressing behavioral comprehension predictors onto neural responses. And this is again during story comprehension in a slightly different data set. And again, we find a strong positive, strong predictive relationship between comprehension difficulty measures and neural activity in the language network, and a non-existent relationship in the MD network. Now, finally, using the same meta-analytic approach on the data from our lab that I've already introduced to you, where we pulled data across 30 diverse experiments, we looked at sensitivity to task demands in the language versus the MD network. And so if a brain region supports a core linguistic computation, which I define as a computation that has to be engaged to extract a meaningful representation from the linguistic input. And you can operationalize it a little more precisely, but this is a reasonable starting definition. So if a brain region supports a core linguistic computation, it should be active regardless of whether you're processing language passively, as in passive reading or listening, like you're doing right now, or whether language processing is accompanied by a secondary task, like maybe I'll ask you a question about how much you understood or something like that. And as I already mentioned earlier, remember the study I mentioned at the beginning by Anya Ivanova showing that under 5 different test conditions, responses in the language network are similar. So now condition bars are grouped by whether they involved passive language processing. So these are now warm color bars, or language processing with an additional task. And there's quite a diverse range of tasks here. And so in the language system, as I would expect at this point, given our past work, we don't find much of a difference between these two conditions. So even conditions with no task, passive comprehension, you get very beautifully strong responses. If anything, they're a little higher here. I don't think this is reliable. But in the MD region, once you take task out of the account, the overall level drops to about 0. And this is quite devastating to any story that one might want to tell about how the MD system contributes to any core computations like prediction, like constructing non-local dependencies, inhibiting irrelevant meanings, word meanings, or parses. This just cannot be true given these data. Okay, so based on this evidence that I reviewed, so here, just showing it to you all at once, it looks like the MD network's engagement likely reflects artificial task demands, and that network does not support core computations related to linguistic interpretation. Okay, and so in the remaining few minutes, I want to touch on a couple of open questions. There are definitely more open questions than these, but you can only do so much in an hour. So I'll just mention a couple briefly. So the linguistic materials that we have focused on so far, at least under naturalistic task-free conditions, have been clearly perceptible and linguistically well-formed. This differs from commonplace comprehension scenarios, which are characterized by both perceptual and linguistic noise. And noise has recently, not so recently anymore, permeated models of sentence interpretation. And so perhaps you could make an argument that the MD network could be important for coping with signal corruption. That said, detecting errors in the input necessarily relies on the knowledge of the statistics of the relevant domain, so language in this case, and corrections of noisy input relies on the knowledge of how noise operates in the relevant domain. So what kind of errors speakers are likely to make, and so on. And these, for these reasons, I think it is unlikely that the letter would support, that the MD regions would support these kinds of computation. I would say that this still plausibly goes on within the language system, but I think there's more work to be done there. The second kind of open area is that we've mostly talked about, well, I guess exclusively so far, talked about language comprehension. Given that language production is kind of more of a goal-directed behavior, if you wish, might the MD network support some core operations in language production? Executive processes have been implicated in both lexical access and syntactic planning, in behavioral, neuroimaging, and patient studies. And so in our recent work, this is work co-led by Jen Hu and Hannah Small, in my group, we started investigating language production. And our initial attempt to simulate production demands was via picture description tasks, which are not ideal in some ways, but also not too bad as a proxy for going from a semantic representation. In this case, it's triggered by not internal generators, but by visual input, to a linguistic utterance. And in each experiment, we had people do a sentence production test. So here they see this picture and they have to say something like, a woman is throwing a frisbee. And the word production task, match for the number of content words, where they would just have to list things like a necklace, a pumpkin, a hammer. While in the scanner, they did this task either by speaking their responses out loud or by typing them out on a keyboard. First, across output modalities, speaking versus typing, this is data across 4 experiments. In the language network, we find the same key signature of language processing that we've long observed in comprehension. So responses are higher during sentence production than during word list production, presumably because of some greater syntactic encoding demands. And in the MD network, we find the opposite pattern, again, similar to comprehension. Responses are stronger during wordless production, putting into question the role of the MD network in combinatorial kinds of operations that are necessary to formulate well-connected, meaningful utterance. So there's more to do there, but these are just some initial steps in that direction. And finally, we have mostly focused on neurotypical adults in this work. However, our brains are notoriously plastic, and tissue that has not been previously used in some function can assume that function, either in addition to the original function or through repurposing. And we know that the MD network is actually especially plastic in this way, given that it flexibly supports diverse behaviors and modulates its responses based on current task demands. And so a hypothesis that has emerged kind of from several groups in parallel, which is often a good sign in science when people are arriving at similar things from through different lenses from different perspectives, is that maybe some parts of the MD network play a role in language recovery. And we have some suggestive data that some areas of the MD network show language-like properties in some individuals with aphasia. However, I think whether this engagement is functionally important, leading to better outcomes, or simply reflects greater processing demands is yet to be discovered. And that's what Swati Kiran and Edan Blanc and some other collaborators are currently trying to figure out in the context of this grant, using a combination of fMRI and behavioral work. And so, including a longitudinal scanning component, God help us. And so our behavioral component is now fully online, which allows us to test people anywhere in the US. And so if you have patients who might be interested in participating, please direct them to us. Just a couple more things. So just the two take-home messages are simple here. The language and the MD network are fundamentally distinct, not to be confused. If you want to draw meaningful conclusions about left frontal cortex, you need to separate them. Otherwise, you'll be getting uninterpretable results. And the MD network does not seem to support core linguistic computations, at least during the production, at least during comprehension. For production, I think we need to do more work first. And I want to end with a speculation. This will take just one more minute and then I will stop, I promise. So I just want to leave you with this speculative, maybe somewhat intriguing idea. So today I focused on two large-scale networks, and using diverse kinds of evidence, I made a case that the MD network and the language network are distinct. Zooming out a bit, I think the original attempts to link these systems stem from a particular construal of language, namely language being deeply tied to complex reasoning. And this construal has its origins earlier, actually, but has been very prominent in the Chomskyan generative grammar tradition, where the focus has been on the syntactic structure of language and the hierarchical representations that underlie these structure building processes. I and others have challenged this link between language and complex thought and the importance of syntactic structure building for understanding the language system in general. And it seems like there is accumulating evidence for an alternative construal of language, which has been kind of gaining ground in the last 20 years or so, where language is instead very deeply embedded in social perception and cognition, and is perhaps kind of a high point of social cognition, allowing us to form more sophisticated relationships with each other than any other species can. And the focus in this construal is on meaning and communication, communicative efficiency. And a few neural data points are now suggesting that indeed linguistic mechanisms and social mechanisms might be linked, including cohabiting interdigitated parts of the lateral frontal and temporal cortex, and above baseline synchronization between those two networks during language comprehension. Very different from the language versus MD systems, which are really at zero. These language and the social systems are dissociable, but above baseline correlated. And intriguingly, the first ever fMRI study of social interaction in macaques from Freiwald's group showed that observing socially relevant signals recruits a network of brain areas, shown in red here, that is eerily similar to the topography of the language network in humans. And so to me, this points to potentially a deep evolutionary link between language and social cognition. And we're now trying to understand the overarching principles of the architecture of social cognition, where language, this large store of form meaning mappings, may be just one piece. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ev. I'm clapping, so yeah, as always, you can virtually hear everybody else clapping too. Thanks so much for a really thorough and clear and extensive overview of your work in this area, and for even leaving us with something to speculate about. We have no shortage of questions, so let's see if you can get through them. The first one is by Kristen Lemhofer, the Stroop task. So I should say these questions were typed during your talk, right?
I got
in some cases you may have addressed something, but
sure.
First question is, the Stroop task surely is not a non-linguistic task.
It depends on what you mean by, it depends on your definition of linguistic, right? So if you take linguistic to mean the use of phonological forms, or even words, but not in the service of expressing or extracting from the signal meaningful information, then I don't think it is a linguistic task in the same sense as sentence comprehension is a linguistic task. When we think of a cognitive system or a neural system, I think we want to think about the kinds of biological and cultural pressures that may have shaped that system. And the language system that I've talked about, I think has been shaped by pressures to try to optimize information transfer and or think. I mean, I haven't fully ruled out the complex thought hypothesis, even though I find it implausible, but certainly the communicative efficiency there is now incontrovertible evidence for. And so it's not really clear how these artificially made up tests that happen to use some phonological representations are linguistic. I'm trying to think of like an analogy in some other domain where like musical notes can be used in a memory task. Do you want to call that a music task? I don't know. I wouldn't. I kind of, yeah. There's probably, I'm happy to follow up online too. So if you weren't satisfied with this, please feel free to email me and I'll engage with anyone on anything.
We have another question from Jason Boland. Could you say more about response variation within the functional regions of interest, so language versus executive function? Is there any evidence that within the relatively large functional ROIs, there may be components more tuned to linguistic processing and other components more tuned to executive function?
Well, I'm not sure I quite understand, because in individual participants, the language and the MD regions are non-overlapping. So it's not just they're more tuned. So I guess maybe the question is whether there's some continuum, and instead of having these very sharply distinct profiles, you have also something that's in between that's maybe doing both. That thing doesn't really exist. I mean, occasionally we see a few voxels at the boundaries of the regions that show a mixed kind of a profile. I suspect that it's due to scanning resolution, like they always happen right at the boundaries. There are a handful of voxels, and we've had plans to try to do higher res scanning to nail that, but we haven't yet. So I don't think it's tuning. I mean, I think there are distinct, stable, natural kinds of networks, and they just do their own thing. They're tuned. One is tuned for language, one is tuned for goal-directed behavior and general reasoning.
And Jason says, that's right, but I'm not sure if that's in response to your answer or in response to your correct understanding of the question. I think it's the former.
The ambiguity of Zoom, yeah.
We have a follow-up from William Matchin on this question. Given relative large functional ROIs, is it possible that subject A may show activation in one region within the functional ROI and subject B may show activation in a different region within the functional ROI, but that activation in these two distinct regions gets averaged within the same ROI?
So I think the problem that William is asking is a deep and important one. So aside from the fact that you can certainly activate the language network in each individual person, no problem, you're faced with the problem of what counts as the same bit between people, right? And in some cases, it's really easy, and in other cases, it's not. So for example, if we again look back to a kind of more advanced field like vision, there have been many, many labs who have worked on the FFA. And when I came to work in Nancy's lab as a grad student, her lab was defining, we're drawing FFAs manually. So they would go within the fusiform gyrus, overlay the faces versus object contrast, and manually draw a region around the biggest clump therein. You would run into problems because in some subjects you come up with two nearby bits that are not quite connected. And then there's this whole literature on the two FFAs. But more importantly, with language, when they showed me how they were doing these things, I was like, there's just no chance. We can't do this for language, because especially on the lateral temporal surface, it's highly, highly variable. And sometimes you see this continuous swath of activity. Sometimes you see two clearly distinct kind of blob-like things. And so without, and we're still kind of working on this with kind of math topology people, but for now, the simplest solution we came up with was to take a whole bunch of activation landscapes, overlay them in a common space, and try to see within which chunks of cortex most people tend to show activation. And then we use those kind of landmarks as to guide the selection of individual subject ROIs. That method works well in a sense that now if you use the parcels that we've derived from this large number of people, if you look what that parcel picks out in any given subject, it's often a big contiguous blob, even though every now and then there may be, you know, some bit bleeding out from the edges. It does happen. It's not a perfectly a perfect system. It certainly does. It certainly works better than trying to apply anatomical constraints on top of individual activation maps, because activations just don't care about little label boundaries that we've come up with. This is at least empirically bottom-up discovered from the topography that you tend to see across people. So in practice, it seems to work well. Whether, like, I think one of the key open questions in that regard is whether what goes on in the temporal lobe. Because in some other domains, people have postulated quite continuous functional gradients going along the temporal lobe. And so whether the notion of distinct, say anterior temporal and posterior temporal bits is even a sensible one, it's not clear. For now, given that in most subjects they separate out, we give them a chance to show distinct profiles. But it may turn out that that's not kind of the right way to think about the temporal part of the language network, which will be kind of maybe more functionally continuous. That's what I have to say about that. But I'm happy to talk more offline, William. Because there's a problem there. There's a tricky thing that has probably more than one solution. Certainly does.
We have a question from Brenda Rapp. With respect to signal fluctuation results, do you find the within/across network dissociation if you only consider the nearby frontal areas, which is really at the heart of the issue?
They're higher there, but if you look across any pairs of regions across any networks, regions that are nearby will often show higher correlations. So controlling for the overall proximity among regions, like across different pairs of networks, it doesn't seem like an outlier, but it's possible that there is something special there. I don't know. I guess I don't have any priors anymore on which part of the language system should be extra special and great than any other part. They're all, yeah. I think they're all nice parts.
They're all great.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should try to understand what each of them do as opposed to try to like rank them in terms of which one is more critical than others or something.
A question from Joseph Posner. For the functional ROI identification, are the identified networks replicable within a single participant across multiple scans?
Oh, yes. They're incredibly, I mean, so in the context of this 800 LANA atlas that we're putting together, we have an investigation of the stability. I mean, we have a paper, Mahold and Fedorenko 2016 tackled that, and we show very robust replicability. They're incredibly stable. I mean, in fact, like when I started scanning enough so that I would have people who I've scanned like, a few months apart, I found that incredibly striking, and that gave me a lot of confidence and happiness about what I was doing, because I was like, okay, that thing is there. I'm just coming in with my little tools and pulling it out as needed to ask whatever question I want to ask that week or whatever. But that thing is just, and and of course the Braga results that I showed from these networks emerging from intrinsic functional correlation data, I think are very nicely in line with that. But yeah, super stable over time. Okay. The longest time we've had was like 10 years, no, 9 years. 9 years is the longest span, and still very stable. I'm sure that as people age and their brains start shrinking, sad as it may be, stuff may look a little more different, but at least within a span of like normal cognitive functioning, it all seems quite stable.
Okay, I have a question from Yanyu Zhang. If the language network is distinct in language functions, why does damage to the areas in this network, like inferior frontal gyrus, not necessarily lead to language deficits? Does that mean the network connectivity is more important for language functions than the functions in specific regions?
There's some presuppositions in that question there. I think which damage, what kind of damage to which parts of the language network lead to what kind of deficit is still very highly debated. And I mean, just like in the last 4 or 5 weeks, several papers came out, all from good groups, making very different kinds of arguments. You can always find some subset that will be coherent and some other subset that will be internally coherent too, but it's not like there's a consensus in the field about what different kinds of damage lead to. There's claims, sometimes really strong claims, some not always very supported claims, but I think we still have a pretty long way to go in telling a complete story, and again, ideally the level of beyond boxes and arrows on the brain of how different components do or don't contribute differentially, which ones are and which ones are not interchangeable, and how the connections may contribute. studying and interpreting connections, we just started a line of work on DTI with Zainab Saigian. And my worry about looking at connectivity is that without a more precise understanding of the computations that the cortical parts are doing, it's going to be very hard to interpret what the connections may do. You can use vague words like production or articulation or meaning, but I mean, we got to do better than that, right? I mean, that just seems a little too vague for any kind of serious proposals. So hopefully, perhaps these artificial neural network models will get us to where animal models got other fields, and we can do something a little more precise.
Okay. We have another question from William and also from myself, but as a good moderator, I'm going to go to questions from other people first. And to mix it up a little bit, here's one from Julius Fredrickson. I can definitely see the value of using individualized functional ROIs, but one might argue that this approach only increases statistical power for specific analyses, but not necessarily discount results from studies that rely on published atlases. Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, so there is a paper in 2012 that we wrote that mathematically shows that in any analysis done with versus without taking into individual variability into account, you gain benefits. You get benefits in sensitivity, so that's your power increase, and you also get benefits in functional resolution. You can mathematically show if you take that information into account. I mean, it's not like you need fancy math for that. You use more information than just stereotaxic locations. You use information about function, but by combining these two kinds of information, you're able to get a lot more out of your data. I'm not saying that any study done with group analysis is totally useless. I would never do it just because I'd like to understand my data like deeper and more intimately. And I think there's potential. There have been cases in literature where group analysis have led people down bad garden paths, scientific garden paths. And I just don't see a reason to risk that. Yeah, I mean, if people want to keep doing group analysis, I'm not going to stop them. We've just tried to say, look, I think you can get more out of your data. We develop these tools. We're happy to train people in using these tools. And they're applicable in aphasia research. They're applicable in imaging research. We've extended this to MEG now. We've extended this to ECOG. We're extending this to single cell recordings in collaboration with the neurosurgeon. So the general approach is very powerful. It's rooted in animal physiology, where you don't just stick a bunch of electrodes and start recording from, inferior frontal cortex. You want to make sure that there's some functional response that is consistent with what you think the function is that you want to test some specific hypothesis about.
I have two questions, one from William Matchin and one from Kristen Lemhofer, which are, I think, similar, although on different domains. So William asks, does the sentence versus non-word list contrast put phonological processing into the MD system rather than the language system? Hold on to that thought. And then Kristen asks, or says, sentences possess meaning, word lists don't. Meaning is not only something linguistic, it includes world knowledge, etc. So are the two comparison conditions fair? The linguistic areas could just as well be responsive for fact knowledge. I think these
great
questions.
Great questions. Yeah. So the first one is phonology. So note that just because you're looking for a region that responds more to A than B, doesn't mean that that region will not also respond to B. It will just respond more to A than B. And so in fact, we find very reliable, very stable responses to non-words across most of the language system. And we're just getting ready to submit a paper on the sensitivity of this system to phonotactics. So we've looked at in a fine-grained way to all sorts of phonotactic constraints, which are definitely part of our linguistic knowledge, just like word meanings and just like larger constructions and rules for combining things together. Tamar Regev, a postdoc, is now leading this work. It should be, we should have a draft on bioRxiv soon. So no, it doesn't subtract it out. It just pulls out a system that is more responsive during stimuli that are meaningful and structured. And I think that all the phonology is going on in the language system as well. And I think we have good evidence for that now. The other question is,
And a similar question was asked by Brenda Rapp later on. So she asked, where does phonology fit into your vision of language knowledge and processing? So the suggestion is that that the phonology in your account may be placed within the MD system.
No, it's all within the language system. The language system basically stores language knowledge. Language knowledge spans all sorts of things from, bigram and biphone collocations all the way to constructions, partially filled, partially unfilled. And it's very, like the way I think about language is very aligned with usage-based grammars and construction grammar approaches, where we store whatever units occur frequently enough and can be helpful. And so we can certainly, there's a lot of evidence that we use phonotactic information to infer higher level aspects of the linguistic signal, so they have to be somehow nearby together. And so I think that's just what the phonological, that's what the linguistic knowledge store is this fronto-temporal system that stores all that. And then when we get input that matches some features of elements stored in that system, you get spikes, you get cells firing, and that's your neural response. You recognize this relevant feature that you're looking for, not unlike the face template starts firing when you get something that fits that constrained layout of, two dark things and a thing in the bottom. But there was some other interesting question that was before Brenda's follow-up on phonology. Maybe not.
You mean one that I read out?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Okay. I am a little sleep deprived. I'm not. I can fabulous stuff.
I'm going through the questions now. I think we should skim a little bit. So Stephen Wilson asks, how do you account for intersubject correlations in the MD network, which, although less than the correlations in the language network, are highly significantly different from zero?
It's a good question. I mean, we elaborate a little bit on that in the paper. I mean, right now, I think the current thinking in the lab is that the fluctuations in the MD system are intrinsically driven, and that's why they're not replicable within people over time for the same stimuli. So perceptually, descriptively, it corresponds to these kind of waning in and out experiences, which we all experience both during listening to talks or reading, right, where we sometimes read and then after a couple of paragraphs we're like, what just happened? I have no idea what just happened. And so you kind of zone in and out. And so some differences along those lines could potentially lead to some consistency across people, in that some particularly boring parts, maybe parts where most subject will be likely to zone out. Again, it would have to be somehow tied to the stimulus, but I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Stephen, sometime. Maybe we can chat. I mean, I have been thinking about that one for a while.
Okay, thank you. A question from Michael Broderick. Have you found any difference between model layers within high-performing ANNs?
We have. It's not super clear cut yet. It's layers that are closer to the middle layers. It's not quite the output layers. It's not super consistent across data sets that we have so far. It's not bad. It's somewhat variable across people and across data sets. There does seem to be some information there. We're adding that stuff to the new iteration of this Martin's draft. But we're very interested in looking at this, and I've put in a proposal to do that more using intracranial human data, because I think it's just going to be too, I think some of the differences in layer mappings would have to be in the temporal domain. And so we want to have something that's better than a 2-second resolution, or even 1 second or something. So there is a plan to explore that in more depth. That program is now building up in various cool ways. I never thought that in my time connectionism will get beyond where it was when I was in grad school, but suddenly it's made some good leaps, and now it's potentially going to help us solve big chunks of language in a serious way.
Okay. In the interest of time, I think we should do just one more. There are more questions, Ev, and I'm happy to send the chat link to you with the other questions if you don't see that.
As long as I see who asked them, so I can follow up.
And people, I'm sure, can always contact you, and your email is on the screen. So this last question is from Irina. Thank you for such an interesting talk. Given the lack of evidence so far as I'm aware, for the significant improvement of language function in post-stroke aphasia recovery after domain general attention training, do you think there's a potential in targeting the executive function in a more language-related way to boost language function? This might imply assuming that the non-linguistic attentional capacity is separable from the attentional capacity involved in language comprehension and production. How reasonable is such an assumption based on what we know now, in your opinion?
No, that's a hard question. There's like a lot of moving pieces there. I mean, so there was some notion that there's some attentional stuff that's language specific, but separate from the MD. I don't know. I mean, first and then first you said that there's like no strong evidence that attention training does anything for recovery. And I mean, I don't know that literature intimately, but it seems like there's at least a handful of studies where some positive effects have been observed with some executive tasks. Maybe it's not consistent. Maybe it's, you know, due to confounds or something like that. But it seems like it would be nice to get a clear answer on that first before spending too much time thinking about potential alternative ways how to do this. But it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think if all of these processes, prediction, you know, building syntactic dependencies, retrieving information from long-term memory when you form non-local connections, if all of this is implemented in language, then yes, absolutely. The thing to do is to train up language. Maybe not train it on weird sentences that they will never encounter in their lives, like reversible passives with 2 full noun phrases. Sorry. I mean, those are sentences. I can make one up too, but if you look at corpora and the kinds of linguistic input that people get, we just don't get a lot of those. So maybe there's some advantages in training people, like on the kind of noisy input that they get. I don't mean perception, I mean linguistically, which I think is where some problems might arise. But their priors are good. Like, they have not lost knowledge of the statistics of the world. And so trying to use these stimuli that artificially take everything away, leaving just one kind of cues, like morphosyntactic cues, to solve this, it's like you're making like a problem solving task, you know? I have to think a little bit sometimes with enough embeddings of like who's doing what to whom. So my hunch would be to train them more on tests that actually reflect the statistics of the kind of language they encounter and the kind of language where they may experience difficulties. And delineating that, of course, is non-trivial as in of itself, but yeah, but I think, I mean, so far, I'm not terribly optimistic that the MD system is functionally important, but I just think that quite the right analysis have not been done, including longitudinal scanning, and that's why we're excited to try this. And if we don't find it there, then I think that will be also very informative and argue against all of these executive-based training therapies. We should know in a couple of years, I guess.
I think that's a perfect note on which to end today's C-Star session. Thank you so much, Ev, for your talk and for being available for all the questions. As I said, there's many more, so
yeah,
I'll send those to you.
Yeah, if you send them to me, that's great.
Thanks to the audience for your interaction, and we'll see you in 2 weeks when we'll be listening to Joe Duffy on primary progressive apraxia of speech. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, friends.